Hi, Booktube, it's Roz, and it's the end of August, so it's time for me to do my monthly roundup video that I call Delights and Discoveries, with sometimes a disappointment or two thrown in. Now then, this month, two of my kind of most delightful aspects of the month in terms of reading, I'm kind of going to skip over in this video because I've talked about them elsewhere. And one is that it was Faulkner in August, and I made four videos for that with Steve about the book that we read, which was The Sound and the Fury. It was a brilliant experience of a read-along. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. Put it in your diary for next August 2021, where we're going to do another book, Sanctuary by William Faulkner. It's been wonderful to go into what is quite a challenging book in so much detail with a lovely group of people, booktubers, our hosts, other booktubers and commenters, and very enriching. But I won't, done enough about that elsewhere to not mention it anymore here. The other thing that I loved about August was it's Women in Translation Month, and that gave me an extra impetus to read even more books by women in translation than I normally would. And I'm going to put up a separate video about that because it would have just taken over this one. So, but I did lots of other reading as well. It's been a very rich reading month all round. And I talked about the Faulkner read-along and how that brought something extra to reading that book, but it's got me reading Faulkner. Last year we did one in 2020, this year 2019 we've done one this year, I will do another next year. It sort of got me to read an author who I was aware of and I'd read one thing by, but was sort of, I'd sort of shelved, but thought I ought to read more of. And I love the way Booktube readathons and special months and read-alongs kind of get me to read something slightly different, or get me to bring to the fore something that might have sat in the back of my mind and I might have never got to. And a perfect example of that for me this month was one of this month's discoveries, which was Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. Wagamese. And so there was a readathon this month called Read-A-thon, asking us to read Canadian books. And the host that I was aware of saw it from was Onyx Pages, but it was more one host. And Canada's a country that I've read lots of books from Canada, but most of those, nearly all of those, are from the sort of white mainstream Canadian society, settler, I guess, society. Interestingly, I've also read quite a few by more recent migrants to Canada, themselves, or second generation. So, people like Rohinton Mystery, brilliant Indian Canadian author, or Madeleine Thien. What I haven't done is read anything by a First Nation author, and so this readathon reminded me of that and gave me the impetus to read a book that had actually been recommended to me by one of my Canadian nephews as a good book to read a first by someone from First Nation background. And now my sort of throwaway line, I suppose, when people ask me about this what I was reading, the book I was reading about Indian Horse, was that I had never in my life imagined that I could read a book with such pleasure and emotion and interest that had significant chunks about ice hockey and actual blow-by-blow accounts of ice hockey matches in it. But how wrong I was. Now, Richard Wagamese says himself, he's dead now, but he wrote this in 2012. Yeah, and he died in 2015, I think. He said that he started out thinking that he was going to write a book about ice hockey, and ended up discovering that the thing that he needed to write about and what the book is really about is Canada's residential school system. Now, if you don't know about those, the residential schools, they kind of lasted for about 100 years from the 1890s. The last one closed in the mid-1990s. They were boarding schools that were about taking First Nation children away from their families and in a very cruel, brutal way, trying to wipe out their language and their culture. Yeah, it, in order to, I don't know, sort of assimilate them into white Canadian society, etc. But not really, just to kind of further disadvantage them by leaving them with nothing. Yeah, it's at best it was a kind of callous, racist system. At worst, it was extremely abusive, and he himself did not go through that system, but he nevertheless would consider himself a victim of that system because his parents and aunts and uncles, his extended family, did, and that affected their ability to parent him, and he ended up in the foster care system and so on, which was equally sort of racist and unsupportive, I guess, to Indigenous culture. That all sounds terribly sort of heavy going. And it's a powerfully emotional book. This book, because it's about a child's experience of abuse and the impact that has on his life, and sort of seeking a way out or redemption emotionally and physically through ice hockey, but actually, yeah, but not. Because of the racism that he experiences as a player. It's actually a beautifully written book. So the landscape of Northern Ontario and Manitoba is sort of fundamental to the book, but also the sort of the ugliness of small towns there. It's and ice hockey. Yeah, ice hockey has a literal role in the book, but it's also it has a symbolic position, I guess, of around sort of mainstream white Canadian culture. Yeah, I'm very glad I read this book. I would read more by him as a writer. I learnt things, but it was a good literary experience, I guess. Yeah. So that was that. Now, another book that I had kind of in the back of my mind, but came to read because of was sort of pushed to the front by a readathon, was this month, was the History Challenge, and I wanted to take part in that, but I was already reading a different non-fiction book that I knew was going to kind of take up that space in my life, around Reading Life this month. So I chose to read a memoir, which was one of the possible prompts for the History Challenge, and I'll say more. I'll link below to the host for that and so on. But the author that it kind of yanked to the front of the pile for me for reading was Audre Lorde, who is an author that I've known of as a poet and an essayist for years. Never read anything by her. Then with the sort of, how because of the sort of resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, there have been a lot of people on Booktube recommending books to read, and it kind of, yes, as part of perhaps our response as readers to that movement, and Audre Lorde's come up again and again. So I decided to read her memoir, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name. Now, this is a very fine book, about which I have slightly mixed feelings, which I will explain. So, obviously, she's predominantly a poet, and some poets really successfully transfer some of their kind of love of language and form into prose, and absolutely she did this. Zami is a really well written book in terms of language. I was, yeah, really completely absorbed, fascinated, and found beautiful her description of her childhood in Harlem, and her kind of the enormous personality of her mother, and how her mother dealt as an immigrant from the Caribbean, kind of dealt with racism in her own way when she became a Black American. Yeah, superb, brilliant first part of the book. Then we get her kind of years of teenage rebellion. Again, really interesting. Her kind of working out her identity. We go off with her on her adventure to Mexico. Yeah, her first jobs, her studies, her first relationships, and that whole coming of age thing of coming to terms with your sort of who you are, your identity, your sexuality. All that is really key in this book and beautifully delivered. Then, and interestingly, about how her sexuality as a lesbian is sort of particularly how that intersects for her with being Black. Um, yeah, yes, and sort of perhaps like white lesbians not understanding her experience of racism. Um, because they feel, or thinking that they understand prejudice because they experience it because of their sexuality, and not understanding the other layer for her, perhaps more fundamental, around race and racism. All that spot on. So weird. It was weird for me when about 3/4, maybe more, maybe 80%, 4/5 of the way through the book, I started to get a little bit bored. And I'm almost embarrassed to say that. And I realised why that was. And that's because in writing this book, she quite explicitly, I think, her intention is to honour the women who've shaped her as a child, a teenager, and a young adult, and sort of through to her mid-20s. And the last few women that do that for her are the women that she has relationships with. And initially, that was really, really interesting. And then it just became a bit like other people's love affairs and other people's sex lives are only interesting up to a point, and then it becomes a bit like another, yeah. I mean, it's like it's not a prudish thing. It's just it kind of becomes repetitive. There's only so much you can say about the act of sex, even if it's brilliant. Yeah. So that was where the book kind of lost me a little bit. But having said that, I can see why it was there, because it kind of, well, not why she needed to tell us so much about individual sexual encounters, but I could see why those relationships were important in the book, and the book as a whole is still a strong recommendation. There we go. Now, oh dear, I need to speed up a bit, don't I? Another theme, I suppose, of this month's reading for me has been rereading. I've had rereading on the mind. Perhaps not surprisingly, because I did a tag about rereading, and thank you everybody who's done that tag. It's been absolutely delightful seeing if we think our reading habits on Booktube are varied, and in this corner of Booktube perhaps, wow, our rereading habits are even more varied. And if you haven't yet done that tag and fancy it, and if nobody's tagged you and I didn't tag you, please do. I'm so enjoying hearing about all the different answers. But so that got me thinking about rereading a bit, and I've reread 2 books this month. And when I did my original of the reread tag, I said that poetry is one type of book that I probably reread most often, and so I did reread a book of poetry this month, and I reread Ariel by Sylvia Plath. And rereading is always a risk. It's a risk of it can't be a discovery. Might it turn out to be a disappointment instead of a delight? Well, not in this case. It was an uncomplicated pleasure rereading Ariel. The poetry is complicated, the ideas, the emotions. she as an individual and as a writer, but just a joy to be back in that place. Yeah. The other book that I reread, there's a more complex story as to why I ended up rereading this book. It's a book called Dusty Answer by Rosamond Lehmann. And one of the delights of this month for me was a Zoom chat that I had with Sean. And that's Sean the Book Maniac. And that he may, I hope, and if he can extract the right stuff from it, put up one of his wonderful two-header videos based on our conversation. And whether he does or he doesn't, if you aren't following Sean and watching those conversations, please do. There's some absolute gems in there with other booktubers, with readers, with writers, and with translators. I particularly enjoyed his two videos with the translator Tina Covey. Very appropriate for Women in Translation Month. So knowing that Sean and I were going to be talking, and knowing that one of our common interests is like British women writers, particularly perhaps the sort of early to mid 20th century, I was thinking about those, and I was thinking about Rosamond Lehmann, who's one of my favourites, and the book Dusty Answer kind of popped back up into my head. I was then doing a tag, the supermarket shopping tag, and I had to pick a book that felt like it had been written just for me, and Dusty Answer was a book I chose. And someone commenting on that video, and I've forgotten who it was now, but it was lovely. They said, "Oh, when you talked about that book, your face lit up," and I thought, yes, it did. My soul leapt as I talked about that book, because and it is a book that I think of as a favourite. But then Katie of Books and Things, I'm sorry, it's a long story, but it does make sense. Katie of Books and Things did the reread tag, and she said something in that really resonated with me. Because what she said was about rereading books. How do you know a book that you kind of say is one of your favourite books if you haven't read it relatively recently? And I thought, blimey, yeah, I've got a whole load of books that I say are my favourite books that I haven't reread relatively recently. And Dusty Answer was right up there in that list, because I have not read that book since I originally read it at the age of, I think, 18. Yeah, somewhere between 17 and, no, it must have been at least 18. And because I just started university when I read it. And it's a book that I would describe as one of my favourite books. And yet I haven't dared to go back to it. And I know why I haven't reread it. Because I've read lots of other books by Rosamond Lehmann since, and she is one of my favourite authors, but I didn't dare reread Dusty Answer because as a book for me it was so tied with a time in my life. That time, like late teens, living away from home for the first time, and I worried that when I went back to it that it would have lost some of its magic. It was so powerful for me at that time that I thought it might have lost some of its magic. Much to my relief, it hadn't. Okay. It is a book that's very much of its period. It was written in 1927, and it was her first book, and she's writing about the world that she knew, which is a kind of upper middle class English, a kind of comfortable, educated existence. Okay. But it is a book that absolutely, for me at least, nails how it feels to be girl on the cusp of womanhood, how it feels to be 15 and having your first crush, how it feels to be in love at 17, how it feels to be a studious child and then kind of start to experiment with having fun in your teens and early 20s, about the going to university experience and relationships there, about exploring whether you might like to have a relationship with women rather than men. Is that, your identity and where you're going, and the misunderstandings that you get into, and it's so frank about what goes on inside young women's heads. Yeah. So, not a disappointment, a absolute delight. It is a first book, and it has, having read quite a lot more of Lehmann's fiction since, it's got some of the, you can, like, it's got first novel faults. It's a little less, it could perhaps have been edited down a bit. some of the language, she's a brilliant writer. She writes brilliant, subtle prose with sort of limpid, I would say, and with wonderful, succinct descriptions. It's a little bit flowerier in places, this book, than her later books, I would say. It's like she obviously she learnt how to hone that with a little bit more experience. But yeah, top book still, top book. The other thing that was really interesting to me about reading Dusty Answer is it made me rethink another book that I read relatively recently, Normal People by Sally Rooney. Now, that is a book that, again, is rather sort of divided people, I think, readers. Obviously, it was hugely hyped, and I read it sort of just around the time that it had been hugely hyped, and I think I kind of reacted against that. And then recently, Sean again read it kind of after the hype had died down, and actually he loved it. And he's a reader whose views I respect, and I often share elements of his taste in books. So I wondered why we'd had such hugely different experience of reading this book. And then when I read Dusty Answer, I realised that there's something, it made me reevaluate Normal People as a book about coming of age, and from a sort of, particularly from the perspective of women, young women, and the difficulty of getting relationships right, and the embarrassment of saying what you end up not saying what you really think, and yeah, I don't know. So I feel I can see why Normal People would kind of hit that spot for someone today that Dusty Answer hit for me when I was 18, if that makes sense. So it did make me feel differently about it. And isn't it interesting how the books we read interact with each other? So books by different authors kind of bounce off each other in our heads as readers. Well, they do for me. Do they for you? Tell me if you have this experience too. And I'm going to wind this up with another kind of illustration of that, I suppose, because as I said, one of the delights of the month has been reading The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. And when I finished that, I felt a bit like, what can I read now that will fill that space in my head for a book that is, challenging but rich. A book that's structurally really interesting. That is, stream of consciousness, ideas, symbolism, images, and brilliantly, it made me realise that this was the moment to pick up Ulysses again. So at the very beginning of the year, I was doing a read along of Ulysses with a number of other booktubers and commenters. And when COVID-19 struck, somehow it just didn't feel like the right thing to be doing. It was, I couldn't bring that level of attention. All of us felt we couldn't bring that level of attention to a book. We didn't want to be doing that kind of detailed unpicking of a book that we were trying to do with Joyce. And we put it aside, but I always said I would come back to it. And finishing The Sound and the Fury left me needing to fill that gap, and it was like magic. Oh yes, this is obviously the right moment to go back to Ulysses. And I've read sort of about 3 chapters over this weekend, and yes, that's going to be a feature of September for me, along with ShapeTube. Now I have to say this: if you aren't aware of ShapeTube, I'll put in the show notes the information about the 4 hosts, Steve and Jason and Rainey and Lukash, and what they're doing. Get into ShapeTube, people. It's one of the best things about September. So, and it's going to do that thing for me that readathons do, of getting me to bring something that I've from the back burner to the top of my reading pile, and that is Venus and Adonis, because I've never read any of Shakespeare's long poems, and Steve Donoghue is doing that as his first week's choice for ShapeTube. So that's 2 of my 2 of my September TBR. Yeah. Have a good month, everyone.